The year everything fractured began with a message so brief it felt like a dismissal, and with a silence that lingered long after. In the heavy air of Wichita's June heat, the Brooks house stood quiet, filled with the faint smell of polish and old routines. Emma Brooks had left work early that day, carrying with her a folder of papers and a small package of new eyeglasses for her father, Henry. He had been squinting more often lately, his hands steady, but his vision slipping, and she had wanted to surprise him with something practical, something that made his days easier. She had also printed an itinerary she had been shaping for months, a plan that echoed his long-ago dreams of roads not taken. It was in that precise moment, with her hands still holding the small white box and the crisp printouts, that her phone lit up. A message appeared from her mother, Linda, and the words cut with a strange precision. There would be no invitation for her to attend Henry's 60th birthday celebration. Family, neighbors, and colleagues would gather at the country club, but she was not to come. The reasoning was cloaked in civility, explained away as a means to avoid awkwardness, but Emma recognized it for what it was: exclusion dressed as propriety. The impact was not loud. It was quiet, and therefore more enduring, like a splinter lodged deep in skin, unseen but impossible to ignore. Inside her chest, the moment flattened into stillness, the kind of emptiness that recalled the flat line of a heart monitor, a signal of life cut short. She stood motionless, absorbing the familiar rhythm of her family's imbalance. Years of subtle comparison with her brother Cole unrolled in her memory like a cruel ledger. Every achievement of hers, no matter how carefully earned, had been reframed as accidental, as something borrowed rather than owned. Her mother's explanations were always polished, always courteous, and always poisoned with doubt. Her father, Henry, had been different, though only in quiet ways. He had watched her closely, listened when she spoke, his eyes marked by the steady patience of a man who had worked decades in the aviation plant. He had seen her as his daughter, yet he rarely intervened when conversations at the dinner table twisted into small trials against her. He had been the steady hand on her shoulder, never the shield between her and judgment. The house around her seemed frozen in preparation for a celebration from which she was now erased. Near the front door sat a pair of polished shoes, waiting to walk into speeches and toasts. On the kitchen counter lay white boxes tied with ribbons, filled with cakes destined for guests she would not meet. And on the dining table, half buried under household bills, rested an old road atlas. The pages had been marked in pencil with straight red lines, tracing a forgotten dream: Santa Fe, Durango, Flagstaff, the Grand Canyon. These were not just stops on a map. They were the fragments of her father's youth, folded into margins during long shifts, stored in the language of maps, because life had not granted him oceans or flights across the world. Emma's finger traced one of the lines across the faded paper, and the gesture felt like pulling at a seam too long held closed. The thin mark of her father's hand became, in that instant, a promise waiting to be revived. That evening stretched endlessly, its minutes sticky and slow. The atmosphere of the house grew heavy with rehearsed politeness, the kind of silence that kept appearances intact. Emma did not argue, did not attempt to respond to the message, did not let her words become more ammunition for those who thrived on diminishing her. Instead, she let herself sit in the dimness of her small apartment later that night, piecing together the fragments of her own strength. The years had stripped pieces from her: approval, acknowledgement, belonging, and fed them into the furnace of family order. She realized now that she had given those pieces willingly, believing they might someday be enough. But sitting in the quiet, she understood that ashes were not her inheritance. From coal, there could be warmth, if she chose to claim it. And perhaps warmth could shape itself into something larger, something with open skies and distant horizons. In that still night, Emma allowed herself to imagine a road unfolding ahead, not as escape, but as reclamation. A road her father once dreamed of, and a road she might still bring to life. The morning arrived with a strange sharpness, as though the world itself had been cut open by a clean blade. The bitterness of the previous night had hardened into clarity. If her father's birthday had been claimed by others, then Emma would return it to him not with banquets and applause, but with a journey where he could simply exist as himself. She began in the attic, pulling down an old cardboard box whose edges sagged with age. Inside was a scattered archive of her father's unfulfilled adventures. Ticket stubs yellowed with time, tarnished brass tokens from forgotten railroads, and curled black and white photographs lay like fossils of another life. She studied a picture of Henry as a boy, standing in a workman's coverall beside a weathered locomotive, the shadow of the train stretching behind him like a promise too large for a child to hold. A folded newspaper clipping slipped out, a small piece written decades earlier about a local mechanic who dreamed of driving Route 285 all the way to Santa Fe to see the land he called the real West. It was her father's name in print, an echo of a longing he never permitted himself to pursue. Piece by piece, she laid out a plan. The route formed itself across her table like a living thread. Wichita to Santa Fe, onward to Durango, then Winslow and Flagstaff, across to the south rim of the Grand Canyon, through Verde Valley, before looping back via Albuquerque and Amarillo. It would not be a trip measured by luxury or convenience, but by meaning. She selected lodgings that carried the weight of stories rather than stars. A neon-lit roadside motel with squeaking signs, an old inn on a town square where time moved more slowly, a modest room with a creaking porch and rocking chairs that had known decades of sunrises. She secured train tickets for the Durango-Silverton narrow-gauge railway, a steam engine climbing through canyons that Henry had once described with reverence. She booked a guided tour of the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, where her father had once stayed, up late reading about Pluto's discovery. She confirmed insurance coverage, laid out his medications in organized containers, and printed the itinerary in bold type so his new glasses would carry no burden. Practicality became part of the offering, each detail a quiet act of devotion. Calls had to be made. She rang their neighbor, Mrs. Ellerby, who promised to feed the cat and collect the stacked envelopes that would gather in the mailbox. At the bank, Emma signed a power of attorney, just in case unexpected turns waited on the horizon. Back at home, she changed her phone's settings so intrusive calls would be silenced, as though every unwanted voice could be reduced to the faint buzz of trapped flies against glass. She did not think of revenge, not in the way others might have. Her mind was not consumed with punishment, but with space. Space where her father could laugh freely without glances of disapproval, space where silence would not be judgment, but peace. On the stove, cornmeal bubbled into warm porridge, the steam rising like morning fog, while on the table a plain envelope waited, thick with cash for the places where plastic would fail and paper still ruled. Each mark she drew on the map, each confirmation email, each carefully folded receipt brought a loosening in her chest. It felt as if she were stitching her own life back together with coarse thread, making the shape whole again. The Kansas heat swelled outside, pressing against the windows, while along the highway, heavy trucks roared past in long, buzzing columns. To Emma, they sounded like an unrelenting rhythm urging her onward, further, faster, without looking back. By the time the sun dropped, the suitcase rested packed by the door. The route was memorized, the details organized with precision, and in her mind she rehearsed the only toast worth giving for her father's 60th birthday. It would not be for the years he had endured, nor for the milestones others wanted to celebrate. It would be for the miles he would finally travel, the roads once lost that would now be reclaimed. The day of Henry's 60th birthday began before the sun had risen, when the streets of Wichita lay suspended in a kind of hushed expectation. The air was cool and fragile, the kind of stillness that feels like the held breath of a city not yet awake. Emma parked her car a block away from her parents' house, unwilling to draw attention with headlights or engine noise, and walked the remaining distance on foot. Beneath her shoes, the pavement radiated the warmth it had stored through the night. In her hands, she carried a thermos, a paper bag with a simple pie, and a slim envelope holding a train ticket that would change the shape of the day. Inside her chest spread a silence that was not empty, but full, a silence with the weight of anticipation, like the hush that precedes the opening of a museum hall. She entered the house quietly, her movements deliberate, and saw her father already awake. Henry stood at the window in his worn robe, wearing the new glasses she had given him. The first streaks of light touched the horizon, and his posture suggested he was standing at the edge of something greater than a morning, something closer to a beginning. His eyes did not carry the detachment of a guest waiting for permission to speak. They belonged to a man who was, at last, being addressed by name rather than obligation. Somewhere deeper in the house, dishes clattered faintly, louder than they should have in the quiet. Yet no voice followed, no questions, no interference. Emma left a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table. It did not contain an explanation, nor an accusation. It was nothing more than a fact written down, that Henry was leaving to follow his own route. The sound of the front door closing behind them was soft, like the final page of a long red book falling shut. The car glided through empty streets, headlights brushing across rows of silent houses. The city receded quickly, giving way to stretches of highway that seemed to pull them forward without effort. By the time they crossed into Oklahoma, the road widened, the horizon drew nearer, and language itself became unnecessary. Silence held its own meaning, free of judgment, free of rules. In that silence, Henry's shoulders seemed to loosen, as though invisible weights had slipped from him. He placed one hand gently on the old road atlas Emma had brought, his breath leaving him in a quiet sigh that seemed to belong to decades, not seconds. A call came through, the phone screen glowing with a familiar name, one that once commanded immediate attention. Now, for Emma, it meant only postponement. She flicked a setting on the device, and the voice on the other end dissolved into nothing, like static smothered in glass. At a gas station, they bought steaming cups of coffee and a cheap keychain shaped like a cowboy boot. Henry laughed at the trinket, a laugh so unguarded and unmeasured that he seemed surprised to hear it himself. By midday, the air grew thinner and drier, shadows cutting more sharply across the land. A film of dust began to etch itself onto the windshield, mapping their progress in pale salt lines. When they reached Santa Fe, the city greeted them with its own distinctive rhythm. Red adobe walls radiating heat, the scent of cedar smoke drifting through narrow streets, the crisp tang of bread cooling in shop windows. A bell struck from a church tower, the sound brief but resonant, like the intake of breath before an answer. They wandered into the plaza, where sunlight pressed itself against old stone. Henry leaned against a warm sundial, his face tilted upward, eyes closed. He looked less like a man celebrating a birthday, and more like someone finally standing inside a dream too long deferred. The weight in his stance shifted, no longer burdened, but grounded. By evening, the messages began. Notifications blinked across Emma's screen. Accusations, anxious demands. Words dressed as concern, but sharpened as reproach. She let them collect unanswered, and then slid the phone into the drawer of the bedside table. Next to it, she placed the envelope for the next day's journey. Tickets for the narrow-gauge railway from Durango to Silverton. With the plan resting there beside her, she fell asleep in a small room scented with adobe dust and warm air, her mind at peace with the knowledge that nothing was going as expected. And that, perhaps, was finally the plan. Steam poured into the canyon like a pale scar, and the narrow-gauge locomotive groaned as if dragged from another century, yet stubbornly alive. The train swayed along the wooden trestles, its wheels shrieking against the rails, carrying passengers through landscapes that looked untouched by time. Inside the carriage, the air smelled of coal smoke, machine oil, and varnished wood, a scent that clung to clothing and skin. Sparks shot from the smokestack, drifting into the sky like glowing seeds scattered on the wind, vanishing in the pine-scented air. Henry sat upright at the window, with the posture of a child seeing the world for the first time. His face was turned toward the passing slopes of dark green pines and jagged cliffs, his expression softened by awe. His hand rested on his knee, steady and quiet, as if anchoring himself in the present. At one curve, when the train tilted and the canyon yawned open beneath them, he pulled from his pocket a worn envelope folded nearly to transparency. Inside were faded scraps, ticket stubs brittle with age, a crude sketch of a station platform, and a penciled map of Route 66. Among them lay a line written by his late father, a wartime mechanic stationed in Arizona, an unfinished promise that one day they would drive this road together. For decades, the paper had carried only longing. Now, for the first time, the promise had a destination. When the train slowed into the mountain station, Emma and Henry stepped onto the platform, where the air was cool and thin. They shared a pie at a roadside bakery, steam rising from its filling as the afternoon sun burned above them. The sky was a wide, flawless blue, without pause or punctuation, stretching endlessly across the horizon. Highway asphalt unfurled in front of them, like a single gray thread leading into memory. They followed it to Winslow, a town immortalized in an old song, where faded murals clung to brick walls, and the streets carried the nostalgia of travelers who had passed before. In Flagstaff, they climbed the hill toward the dome of Lowell Observatory. The silver curve of the telescope gleamed against the evening sky. Inside, Henry lingered over the black and white photographs of distant planets, the faint smudges of light captured on glass plates more than a century old. He gazed at Pluto's image, faint and blurred, and smiled. It was not the smile of regret, but of recognition, as though time had quietly assured him that nothing had been lost, only postponed. That night, the phone pulsed with interruptions, each notification flickering like insects against a lamp. Messages arrived from her brother, heavy with the language of concern, though edged with suspicion. Calls came from her mother under the banner of family duty. Acquaintances wrote in tones of anxious civility, asking whether everything was in order. Emma, unmoved, replaced the SIM card as one might replace a filter in a machine. The noise vanished. The air cleared. One evening, they stopped at a small notary's office tucked behind a street of shuttered shops. The room smelled of paper dust and leather bindings. Henry signed his name slowly but firmly, updating documents that had sat untouched for years. He designated a trusted friend as guardian for unfinished matters and left words in his own hand that named what and who held meaning for him. He was not choosing sides in a family conflict. He was choosing his own voice. On their way out of the city, flashing lights halted them at a checkpoint. A patrol officer leaned in, speaking of a report about a missing elderly man. Henry handed over his passport, his gaze steady, his back straight. The officer studied his face, saw not confusion, but clarity, and with a short nod stepped aside, waving them forward into the night. The car rolled on, its headlights cutting through desert dark. They spoke little as miles slid beneath the tires. The silence was not void but vast, an expanse wide enough to contain both of them without tension. In that space, between the hum of the engine and the endless road, father and daughter found something rarer than words. They found room to exist, unchallenged and unmeasured, inside the vastness of their American odyssey. The Grand Canyon revealed itself at dawn with a silence that seemed unbreakable, deeper than the chatter of tourists and stronger than the burst of cameras. The horizon opened into a vast chasm, layers of stone lying before them like the pages of an ancient book, each stratum recording a chapter of time written in sediment and color. The morning air was sharp and still, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dust. Henry stood at the overlook, his hand barely resting on the railing. His posture shifted subtly, as if something within him had aligned, like a bone long broken and finally set straight. The sun crept upward slowly, reluctant to claim the canyon as its own. The light softened the ridges, drawing lines of shadow across the jagged cliffs, unveiling shades of ochre, crimson, and violet. Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a small box, worn at the corners from her handling it during the journey. Inside was a simple gift, a brass whistle modeled after those carried by train engineers, the same kind she had seen in an old photograph of her grandfather. When Henry held it, the metal caught the morning light. He pressed it gently in his palm, and the smile that spread across his face was not sudden but natural, as though it had always belonged there, waiting for this moment. They descended one of the narrow trails, not with the ambition of proving endurance, but with the quiet certainty of confirming their right to walk where they chose. Loose gravel crunched beneath their steps, and the canyon walls rose around them like guardians of memory. They stopped after a short distance, enough to feel immersed, yet not conquered, their breaths steady and unhurried. Each step carried the weight of recognition, not achievement. On their return, they turned toward Verde Valley. There, among the rolling hills and rows of vines heavy with fruit, they found a small vineyard. The air was cool inside the stone cellar, shaded by barrels stacked in long lines. The smell of oak and fermenting grapes clung to the space. Henry selected a bottle without hesitation, ignoring labels and prices, and asked the winemaker to mark it with the date. It was a date he intended to remember, not for the occasion others denied him, but for this morning carved into the canyon's silence and the wine's promise. By late afternoon, they returned to Flagstaff, where the brightness of their journey met the shadows of the past. At the hotel desk stood familiar figures, faces taut with disapproval, arms crossed in postures that spoke more of judgment than of care. The confrontation never became a scene. There was no shouting, no open demand for him to return, only the heavy presence of eyes that weighed him like a defendant. Henry straightened his back, his hand resting firmly on Emma's shoulder. The gesture was quiet but unmistakable, a declaration stronger than any argument. Beside them stood a woman who chose not to see the meaning of that hand, her gaze fixed elsewhere, her silence calculated. It became clear then that celebration had never been about tables of glasses or rehearsed speeches. It lived here, in the air that did not demand permission to breathe freely. Father and daughter walked past the unspoken challenge, climbed the stairs, and closed the door behind them. In their room, the world outside ceased to exist. They spread out the map once again, tracing the same route they had already taken. They decided to retrace their steps rather than carve a new path, preferring the comfort of places that had already welcomed them. The desert beyond Modoc could wait. That evening, Henry set up a small camera on the balcony and spoke for a few minutes. His words were not apologies nor defenses. They were simply a record, evidence that the choice to walk his own road had been his, freely made. The camera light blinked once, steady and certain, then went dark. The night smelled of dry dust mixed with the faint promise of distant rain. Voices rose faintly from the street below, laughter spilling from a passing group, the low murmur of an argument over parking. Above them, the sky stretched wide and unbroken, echoing the canyon they had stood before at dawn. And within themselves, they carried a similar vastness, quiet yet immense, a space where no one could intrude. The house greeted them not with reprimands, but with the ordinary thickness of summer air, the heavy warmth that clung to every wall, and the muted light of midday that blurred the edges of the furniture. Wichita had not changed in their absence. The streets carried the same rhythm of quiet suburbia. The lawns were cut to the same uniform height, and the neighbor, Mrs. Ellerby, lifted her hand in greeting as if they had merely returned from a routine trip to the supermarket. Life around them had continued without pause, indifferent to the distance they had traveled. Inside, Henry set about finishing what the journey had begun. In the office of a lawyer downtown, he calmly repeated the steps he had already started in Flagstaff. He altered his will, added letters sealed in envelopes, and signed pages that had once seemed remote and unnecessary. Each stroke of his pen was deliberate, steady, an act of ownership over his own story. When the papers were stacked and filed, they carried the weight of permanence. Back at the house, he moved through the garage with a measured pace, sorting through years of accumulated objects. Broken tools and rusted scraps were hauled away, leaving behind only what still served a purpose. Boxes of forgotten belongings were given away, the so-called eternal things that had lingered on shelves now passed into other hands. The house felt lighter with each item removed, the air less burdened by ghosts of utility. Linda's messages, once long and brimming with sharp undertones, ceased. In their place arrived a single formal notice, an invitation to a family discussion. Its tone was lofty, its intent unchanged. Emma and Henry did not attend. Instead, they sat on the front porch, the evening air pressing warm against their skin. And in that quiet sitting, there was more celebration than in any banquet hall. Cole attempted to shape his resentment into strategy, speaking through others, suggesting interventions, and hinting at reconciliations that carried conditions. His anger, however, corroded like rust. It spread without repair, consuming rather than mending. Emma and Henry did not argue back. They offered no defenses and no counterpoints. They lived within their own home, as though it had finally ceased to be a stage for performance. Weeks unfolded into a calmer rhythm. Henry reduced his working hours at the plant, stepping back from the demands that had once structured his entire existence. In the evenings, he began tinkering with an old bicycle, the same model he had ridden decades earlier in the factory lot. On Sundays, father and daughter drove to the edges of the city, following empty country roads. They stopped at shaded clearings, the scent of pine resin and salt carried in the air, and shared simple meals in the quiet of those open spaces. When autumn came, Henry carried a small box to the local museum. Inside were the faded coupons, ticket stubs, and the delicate envelope that had traveled with him all those years. He offered them to the curator as fragments of a lived history. In return, he received a letter of thanks and a small photograph published in the town newspaper, not hidden in the sports section this time, but given a place of honor in the community column. The cycle of a year closed with a morning departure before sunrise. They did not drive far, only far enough to feel the road hum beneath the tires and the horizon stretch open. Road signs flickered past in steady intervals, birds crossed low over the highway, and from the glove compartment came the faint metallic sound of the train whistle. Life had not become perfect. It had not punished anyone by borrowed measures of revenge. It had simply found its place again. Henry stood at the center of his own story, no longer shifted to the margins. Emma sat beside him, not in the shadow of assistance, but in the active role of steering. And beneath everything, as deep and enduring as basalt buried under sandstone, rested the quiet understanding that one short, cutting refusal had opened a door into air that finally allowed them both to breathe.